Thank you so much. I see some activity in the chat box, and I want to formally welcome you all. Good morning to the Equity and Justice Center Action for Climate Empowerment presentation. This is the first event in the EarthLab Salon series. This series is possible thanks to a seed grant provided by the Office of Minority Affairs and Diversity at the University of Washington and co-sponsored by EarthLab, the UW College of the Environment Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and the UW Center for Communication, Difference, and Equity. While the COVID-19 pandemic does not allow us to hold an in-person event, it becomes even more important to create ways to come together as a community, reflect on our actions, and look to our future. I want to express to you my gratitude for joining us in this event, especially during these difficult moments. Before we begin, we would like you to introduce yourself using this chat box to create a sense of community. If you can, please share your name, pronouns, and affiliation. And we also want to know where you are joining us from. So we have created a special form where you can introduce your zip code. No other information will be requested in this form, and this will allow us to create a map that we will share with you in coming months once we have a digital publication of this series. Your participation in this exercise is completely optional and voluntary. At the University of Washington, we recognize that we are in the land where numerous tribal communities have lived in since time immemorial. University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish people of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Maquishit nations. However, many of you might be joining us from different parts of the state or even the country. So this is a great opportunity for you to check out what are the groups around you. There's an incredible resource. It's a map, and I'm going to copy the link on the chat if you want to access it. This will help you to explore what languages are spoken in your area and what Indigenous groups are present in that land. I will also like to go over a few housekeeping items so you know exactly what to expect and how to engage with today's presenters, Deb Morrison and Frank Niepold. This event is being recorded for the purpose of making it accessible to people who could not join us today. A window might have popped up on your screen notifying you about this. For purposes of time, we will keep all participants muted, but feel free to share your questions and commentaries using the chat box. Your questions will be read out loud by Deb and Frank or by some members of EarthLab at the end of this presentation. We want to keep this event as safe as a friendly space for all, so we are just allowing our hosts and co-hosts to share their videos and their screens. We please ask you to stop sharing your video if possible, because this will allow us to have a more stable signal. And I know that many of us, these new digital and virtual environments are new, so please have some patience with us. Before introducing myself and the rest of the hosts of this event, I want to thank Lindsay Henney, Constance McBaron, and Jessica Nectalon from EarthLab from helping us organize and host this event. My name is Isabel Carreras Amanillo, and I work in the College of the Environment Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion as the Program Operations Specialist for this office. Our office supports faculty, staff, and students in the college to become aware of equity and inclusion topics and advance in the creation of a more welcoming space to work and study. We also collaborate with several groups within UW and outside UW in topics such as environmental and climate justice, as well as foster inclusive career pathways. Now, I want to share the microphone with my friends, colleagues, and co-hosts, Gina Aftab and Sarah Breslow.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Gina Aftab. I am the Assistant Director of the for the Center for Communication, Difference, and Equity at the University of Washington. We create spaces where our community of students, faculty, staff, and alumni can gather to promote greater equity. Through collaborative research, community events like this one, and action-oriented classes, we critically engage race and its intersections to ultimately change the structure of power around us. So when Sarah Breslow from EarthLab asked me to collaborate on the Salon series, we jumped at the opportunity. I'm so excited that the inaugural Salon had more than 180 registrants, and we're looking close to 100 Zoom participants today. So thank you for your interest in this very important topic. This Salon series starts with the question, what does it mean to center equity and justice in environmental work? For most of us, environmental work is inherently about equity and justice, but what that looks like in practice can differ widely. This Salon series will highlight collaborative projects that bring together transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary scholars and leaders in our area to begin and strengthen difficult conversations. The series also recognizes that environmental solutions must be co-created with the communities they impact and must redress injustices and exploitative structures of our past and present. We called on any number of our UW community to present in this series, including faculty, staff, or students. And our next two salons, starting next fall, will feature two UW undergraduate groups and their local community partners. And with that, I will turn it over to Sarah to introduce herself and our speakers today. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I am Sarah Breslow. I am the social science lead and transdisciplinary lead at EarthLab at the University of Washington. And I'm very excited to be here today and excited to see many people in the audience that I recognize, and also looking forward to meeting those of you who I don't. And very honored to be working with Gina and Isabel in co-organizing this series. EarthLab is a new environmental institute at the University of Washington whose mission is to accelerate and focus UW expertise to address large-scale environmental challenges, making positive impacts on people's lives and livelihoods. I have the distinct pleasure to introduce our speakers today, who will be speaking on equity and justice-centered action for climate empowerment. Dr. Deb Morrison is a learning scientist at the Institute of Science and Math Education in the UW College of Education. She is deeply engaged in research practice partnership efforts around equity and justice in STEM learning contexts, particularly with respect to furthering climate justice. This work is done through a cultural lens centered on differential participation within and across varied communities of practice, and seeks to disrupt oppressive structures limiting participation. Frank Niepold is the Climate Education Coordinator at NOAA's Climate Program Office in Silver Spring, Maryland. He's also on the Climate.gov Education Section Lead, a co-chair of the U.S. Global Change Research Program's Education Interagency Working Group, the U.S. Climate Action Report Education, Training, and Outreach Chapter Lead for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, Education and Youth Delegate for the United States at the 2015 Conference of Parties, and a member of the Federal Steering Committee for the 4th National Climate Assessment. Please help me welcome Deb and Frank. Thank you, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share our slides so we can get going, but it is a great honor, and let me start this over here. I really appreciate the flexibility that everyone is using. Oops, not that, present. Sorry, we're all learning in real time here. So this is a great honor, and I really appreciate the ability to be with you today I wish I was in Seattle, but obviously we're practicing safe strategies and being more productive as a result. So thank you. Deb?
Yes, very excited to be with you today, and we're going to have a discourse between Frank and I. We decided we would disrupt the sort of normal, just one of us talking, and we're going to have a conversation back and forth around a series of questions. So Frank will set us up with a couple of slides here and with an initial Menti slide, because we'd like to know a little bit about your thoughts.
So if you just go to menti.com and use the code 225926, I'm going to jump over there in a second, but I'm just going to leave it here a little longer. So 225926, and we'll see. Whoops, didn't mean to do that. And whoop, come on, where are you? All right. Whoops, I got to do this. Too many things going on. Wrong one. There we go. So we should see the results coming in. Slide the code 22. So just what brought you here in 5 words? Hopefully this works. There we go.
All right, let's go ahead and what would your 5 words be?
My 5 words?
What brought you to this talk?
Let's see. Accelerating climate action through, I can't just say education because I need to qualify it. Accelerating climate action through or with inclusive education. I can't do it. What about yours? What do you got? What's your 5?
Mine is climate, community, justice. I'm not going to put them into a string. I'm just going to throw 5 words out there. Futures and sustainability.
Wow.
Go with that. All right, let's see what we have so far, and let's
Wow.
we can come back to it later as well.
This is awesome.
We can't see your screen, just so you know.
Oh, we can't see it?
No.
Oh, because I stopped sharing. Oh, I hit too many. Let's go here. There we go. There. Now can you see it?
Yep, we got it. Oh, that's terrific. And so if we can, we'll put the feedback chart in the chat too, so we can see it and people can see it as it's coming in. That'd be great.
Yeah, definitely. I will share that because I think it's really interesting to see the perspectives. As a former teacher, I always want to know where people are coming from. This is a great tool to give us a sense of it, although we'll have to dig in a little bit deeper to do it right.
All right.
Do you have a sense of it, Deb?
Yeah.
Awesome. So let's go back over here and go to here and go to here. And we're back.
All right. We skipped one forward there.
No, did we?
Yeah, there we go. Okay.
Yep, we're right. And there's a reason why this picture is up. So the way that we're going to do this, and I think, maybe I should give a little bit of context to who I am and how I got to be here. That might help.
Yeah, and let's
people.
talk a little bit about the international lens that this slide sort of represents. Yeah, go ahead.
So back in 2005, I was asked to lead how education would contribute to creating something called a climate smart, climate literate nation. And ever since then, I've been working at many levels inside the United States and beyond the United States. So one of my responsibilities is to support the integration, coordination, implementation, and and liaison of what we do at the international treaty level, which is now called Action for Climate Empowerment. That's why we put that in the title, which is education, training, public access, public awareness, public participation, and international collaboration on to ensure that we are effective on climate action. So, and I've been doing that for a really long time, and it gets really interesting. But one of the great honors of my career was to represent the US government to the Paris Agreement Conference of Parties, COP21, representing education and youth. And we had been doing extensive work in the United States and liaisoning some, but it was really here that we really started to see the power and the importance of how education, community engagement, training really bring power to the work we're doing across the world to, implement and avoid dangerous climate change and implement solutions in scale, in time. So, but that's an interesting space to be looking at it from that international 197 plus country level all the way down to, community scale across the country inside the United States. So but I think one of the things we're learning as we do this work, and we're rapidly evolving right now, is looking at how does education, training, public access, public participation, public engagement, and international collaboration and training accelerate. Is it a nice to have, or is it a need to have, or is it a must have in really meeting our objectives? And then, through our conversation preparing for this event, we started unpacking more of that equity and justice dimension of why that's also critical, not nice, but actually critical to the work. So I don't know if that helps frame it.
And it's interesting because I sort of came at this work from a very different direction. As a scientist engaged in global modeling work originally with some of the nitrogen cycling work, I was really interested in the struggle that we have as a society to understand systems level thinking and to engage with the scientific community. So about 20 years ago, I moved into education and really worked at a much more grassroots level for a long time. So very much the opposite of, in some ways, the trajectory that Frank has had. And, through my experiences in education, was really thinking a lot about the amazing youth I worked with and the voices that they had as scientists, as potential contributors to this field and the work that we have in our communities. And yet I saw that they didn't see themselves in that work because of the way that oppressive structures are really limiting opportunities and authentic engagement from different perspectives and positionalities in the world. And so how is it that we can actually foster that more? So I came into this work really through a K-12 education, and I know Frank has that background too.
Yep.
And so the ACE work, in the last couple of years, I've become more involved with the international community with the ACE work, so the Action for Climate Empowerment effort. And really thinking about what is it that we can do globally that impacts our local work. And what really, really got me hooked in this space was the way that I have seen in grassroots efforts in the Pacific Northwest, both in Canada and the US, the way that I've seen the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People leveraged for local work. That was a UN declaration. I was like, well, if we could get something like that in place that had justice at the center, for the learning component of climate change, we would be rocking this. So that's my sort of hook into this space.
Absolutely. What I find really intriguing about the climate work is it draws people in from all different domains, focuses, expertise, knowledge bases, and everyone started somewhere and they built up something somewhere and then they brought it in with purpose into this work. And I think, as time goes on, climate change and transitioning to a low carbon, resilient, communities worldwide is going to continue to demand more and more focus in order for us to be successful. And it's just really interesting seeing how these diverse perspectives come in, which I think is a really beautiful way of thinking about this topic, and the frame that we're using, or the focus of this talk, about the equitable and just aspect of that and why that's critical. So, but,
Yeah.
so
to help organize our conversation today, we have a few different questions, and we're going to start into these questions, but we're going to start at a very high level of climate action generally, and then we're going to dig into climate action with justice and equity, and then into learning a little bit more. So we're going to kind of dig down into the topic.
Yep.
So I'm going to ask Frank the first question, and we'll flip over to the next slide. So how do we accelerate climate action? Like, what do we do to accelerate climate action? We know the world is in this challenging place, and in this time of COVID, potentially we have a really unique opportunity to think about this. So what do we do?
So one of the reasons why I like looking at this picture, because I was at this event, and Cristina Figueres is right there in the center, who led the Paris Agreement process, but she's surrounded locked in arms with young people, and so there's something really important that we learned, and so when we were leading the President Obama's, we expanded in a federal partnership with the White House. The Climate Action Plan under Obama, a climate education and literacy initiative. And the reason I was at COP21 was part of that, because I wasn't just me, I was representing a wide swath of initiatives and programs and capabilities and partnerships across the United States at COP21. So, I was a liaison and a representative, not myself. But what's interesting about this, and there's a key here about how do we accelerate, is that it's intergenerational. And there's something really important about the intergenerational dynamic in accelerating climate action. Adults think differently when youth are in their view, in their engagement, in their thinking, and in their motivation. And so that's something in here. And also that these young leaders, when you talk with them, they also bring extra capabilities and preparations and capacities that are really needed, because there's a lot of work implied with changing everything. It's not just an easy task, it's a very important task, and it's a sustained task. So we're talking about decades of effort. So accelerating, I think one of the other points I think is really important to note is that the car is not braked and sitting still right now. We are already addressing climate change in broad, substantial ways. We have a lot more to go, but we're not starting from no movement. So acceleration is always easier when you are actually already moving. And I think that this idea of future generations and thinking about that. So one of the things we noticed when I was up where we were at COP21, this picture on the left is of all the subnational leaders meeting in the Paris City Hall. And so they're governors, mayors from all over the world. And really what we're learning is that the scale of climate action is actually much smaller than nation. It's richer. And so, we're in a Washington state context here. There's a lot of very powerful work going on at the state and sub-state level that the people that are represented in this international version are there. But then the other side of it is the youth empowerment, youth leadership, youth engagement is coming in parallel with that. So we're realizing subnational is really, really important. And we're realizing, we should have known this, but we're realizing that the youth voice and the youth activation and the youth empowerment and calling for what they want the future to be is having an effect on the people on the left. So the intergenerational dynamic is really well positioned between these two sides. We're seeing that very powerfully, but that doesn't mean that we can't do more of that at community scale across, as opposed to, just at these international meetings. That's kind of what we're seeing is really starting to ramp up.
There was a really interesting paper that is just coming out now, and we've known about it for a while because of the community, but called The Powers of 10 that really talks about this and thinks about, and I just threw it in the chat window, that talks about the optimization of social agency around climate action at particular scales, and that community scales are very impactful and effective. And many communities, especially historically marginalized communities or communities addressing climate change impacts, really in an immediate way right now, know this. They know that they need to act in their own spaces in particular ways while also having systemic supports. So a lot of the work that you're talking about and the work that I've been doing, especially in the last 10 years, is really focusing on some of those larger systems change to support that community move. Like, how do we actually foster accelerated climate action in community spaces? And to the point that that picture around all the different local governments face, I think that's a really important thing, you know, even for us to, in all our different roles that we have in the world, to think about what is our responsibility in local government spaces to speak with the voices we have. I'm actually a locally elected official in my own community, and really take on that responsibility to, I instigated a climate emergency motion a year and a half ago, and am engaged with the Islands Trust area in trying to think about what that means and how we change policy to accelerate climate action in this area.
It's critical. It's critical, and yet I think what we're realizing is they don't understand and appreciate the power of the enterprises that are around them and how to activate them. That's one of the things we're learning. So, you know, just to keep things moving, Deb, is it okay if I jump to the second question, or is there more that we need to? Yeah, and maybe one other point that I think is bearing, because it relates to the acceleration, is, you know, we need to accelerate massively within the next 10 years. We're not done, but if we don't accelerate, you know, over the next 10 years, then it'll be really impossible to hit the final speed we need to be at by 2050, no later than 2050. So, you know, that's really the urgency is coming from what we're seeing in the climate science and the climate system. So, let's jump over to the next question. I like this dialectic style where we're moving through us and building down and deepening. So Deb, why, given what we just said, why focus on equity and justice? And how does equity and justice, just climate action, allow society to accelerate their action? That's I think a crucial part of this conversation.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it's an unpopular question in some ways, because many folks working in the space of climate justice don't always tackle that question. Yet in spaces that are sort of normative or in dominant power positions in society, we have to really ask that question. So why are justice and equity central, and why should they be? There's an inherent right, obviously. We have a basic right to equitable opportunities and access to careers, to knowledge, to sharing our community practices, to having our knowledge and practices and histories centralized. So there is an inherent right argument that's made in this space. And you see that a lot in different veins of research. However, there's also, related to that right, is about the right to design and participate in the future in particular ways, not just in the economy, but also in designing what the future should look like. We know that what got us here is a particular way of thinking, and what's going to get us out of the challenges we are currently facing is probably not more of the same. So how do we actually broaden both science, democratic participation, you know, hopefully all our legislators, all our elected officials, how do we diversify and broaden them, not in just our embodied differences, but also in the perspectives that we take on the world, the way we think and the way we act in the world, and the values that we bring to our effort. And so this type of diversity of thought, diversity of values, diversity of ways of being, that comes from really transforming the way that we work in science, the way that we work in our society. And the reason that can be so beneficial for accelerating climate action and environmental sustainability more broadly is we need that diversity of thought. We need that diversity of perspective. We also need that collaboration and coordination going forward. You know, just more of the same is going to become a lot harder, a lot more conflict. It just doesn't seem like it's a good decision for us to go down that path. And the controls, Malthusian controls of disease, war, and famine are something that we have the intellectual power to overcome if we choose it.
So I mean, you know, I think the community aspect, right? Who makes the decisions about community, where community is, how? Because I mean, you know, there's a lot of pushes and pulls and challenges to community. One of the ones we had talked about was that the just as one microcosm within the Washington State example was the Quinault work between NOAA and other organizations, and really looking at just one little village in one part of the world, in one state, and how that worked in the context of this you know, equitable and just action. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Because I mean, we had had this example. You mind if I jump the slide?
Sure, that'd be great. And you know, there are so many examples across America and across the world. I think this is a fabulous example because it integrates a lot of work across different science communities, both Indigenous and NOAA-based scientists, and thinking about how to adjust and adapt to existing climate challenges while still drawing on local community needs, community resources, building capacity in communities for addressing new things that are coming. And the Quinault have been working with the NOAA offices and other scientists to really think about how to relocate their village site to a higher level area because of the risks that they have from sea level rise, from tsunami potential challenges, and just to make them safer and more resilient to issues that are coming. But the way that they did this drew on a lot of different knowledge bases and knowledge of place in their community, and a collaborative process that really allowed them to think and move and work and draw on all different types of knowledge bases. This type of practice is what we need to see going forward. We need to bridge across all different cultural backgrounds to be able to draw the best resources from any community together for a particular problem we're facing. And this is going to allow us to be able to become more resilient for adaptation. But even more important potentially is how we think about mitigation, how we think about actually reducing carbon in the atmosphere and hopefully reversing some of the impacts of climate change.
Absolutely. Yeah. You know, this is a heavy one, right? Because this is their place, their community, and their vulnerability, and building their resilience in partnership.
And we're thinking here too about, you know, this is a really interesting situation of not abandonment of communities, but of care and an ethic of working together and figuring out what can be done. What can be done around environmental management, so the socio-ecological components that Dr. Megan Bang and others have talked about, the place-based effort that Eve Tuck and Marcia McKenzie and various climate-focused individuals around place are really thinking about. Those are areas that we really need to think carefully about how different issues are being addressed, and how we're centering resources in that space. So these are collaborative grant-funded efforts by the federal government with tribal communities that are happening, but they're not everywhere. They're in like little pockets right now. And one of the ways that we can accelerate climate action from a justice point of view is how do we really diversify and extend that network? How do we increase grant programming? How do we cross-link efforts between different agencies that are already funded, but are not necessarily geared at these particular communities that are like frontline communities in this space? You know, yeah.
But it's funny, not funny, haha. It's funny. It's important to note that this example I pulled from, these graphics come from the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit, something that my office and my division support. And what we're doing is lifting up effective practice across all sectors and across all geographies and all communities to the best of our ability, and lifting them up and then promoting them as examples to share. So this is one case study that we used to illustrate how communities and the tools and the strategies and the techniques and the benefits and the timings and the fundings and all the nuts and bolts that if another community needed to do this, here are some things that you could use to accelerate your practice. So this is exactly an accelerator. This is an accelerator. This is part of that acceleration process, because you don't have to fumble along when somebody else has learned it before you. You
And
can
this
just
is
use
the
that.
perfect segue, Frank. You just gave me the perfect segue to our other question, which is about how does learning help accelerate climate action while also centering equity and justice? Because that learning component, these things are happening in different locations. And when you start to seek them out, you can see them across the landscape. But how do we actually foster the learning that is so deep and rich in these examples?
You know, and it's, so hang on everybody. The reason why I chose this image was I was thinking about it and I was like, you know, when Deb and I were prepping for this and we were thinking about, you know, access is a really important aspect of this, right? Because access to learning, access to information, access to knowledge to use information is a really important part of how human beings work. Now, if you go back in time, access to information was actually a privilege. And so those who had power and the ability to shape events had an advantage. And now they use that advantage to their advantage. This is a map of the treaty that led to the separation between Spain and Portugal of how they were going to explore or exploit the world. And, you know, and it was facilitated by the Pope. So this isn't, you know, this is why Brazil, they speak Portuguese and the rest of South America, they speak Spanish, because Portugal got the east part and Spain got the west part. But just that idea that they had a map, they could put a point there, they could divide it up, and then they could, you know, focus on that, really gives you insight into the idea of exclusive access versus all having access. And, you know, so when I think about this, you know, access and opportunity, because, you know, most of the times when we talk about climate change, we talk about the challenges, but there's also immense opportunities in this space. All the economic analyses I've seen about implementing climate action in line with what we call for in the scientific community is a net increase to the global economy of trillions of dollars. It's not a loss to the economy. It's a new economy. It's different than this economy, but there is an economy that works on the other side from the economic analysis I've seen. But who gets to choose and have access to those new directions is really an opportunity to either deepen our learning about which things we want to focus on and then be prepared for, and then to be able to take those advantages and opportunities. You know, I mean, one of the greatest questions I was ever asked by a young man in the 7th grade when we were talking about climate change, and we were doing a talk quite a few years ago, and he asked me, you know, if I understand climate change, does that mean all the jobs are going to change? And if you think about a young person, a 7th grader, they're thinking about what they're going to do over the next set of years to prepare themselves for a future. And so that's exactly why we're having this conversation, because the stuff we're talking about is long work. And the people who are in 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade, young people worldwide, are thinking about that different future. And so, but our systems, our educational systems aren't really working to this purpose yet. This is part of our challenge that both Deb and I share, is we're looking at transformational learning that is not just in a school. It is community-wide, life-wide. It's coming from lots of aspects, and its coherence is actually what matters more than its location and its purpose. And so, you know, I think that the idea of centering, as we're looking at the effective practices, centering the work inside the community's action. So what we're seeing in a lot of funds that we're leading at NOAA is that merging climate action and community-based learning actually accelerates community climate action and builds capacity for that action simultaneously. That is no small innovation, but its implications are massive. It's emerging, I think, is the best. But I really think that and I remember right, when I think about this graphic, and this is the project drawdown, and this is just the drawdown side, which is really the mitigation and the drawdown, and then throw resilience in there as well. So it's bigger than just this. This is just an example. But you've got so many areas of transformation. And so this is the purpose and the work before us, whether you're talking about electrifying bikes, which we're using a lot more of, throwing electric on there, connected to renewable energy, and we're cooking with electricity, I guess. No more cooking with gas. But building with wood, bioplastics, composting, forest protection, geothermal, green root, you just keep going. But these are only work if they're broadly implemented across our communities, within our communities, by people who are doing things with jobs, with purpose, rapidly, very soon. So this is the map of opportunity for me.
Yeah, and in thinking, it's interesting because in thinking about the difference between education and learning, there is actually a pretty big difference. And we were talking about this originally when we were thinking about this conversation, that education itself, the structure of schooling has lots of history of oppression inside it and lots of challenge. And what we're talking about here isn't that educational structure per se. It's part of it, and potentially a whole transformation of it is what needs to be done. But what we're really thinking about is the way that we engage in learning broadly in all different contexts across all different places, inside communities, in place, in work environments, in new emerging work environments, and how that might be intergenerational, how that might involve different worldviews and perspectives that we take on the actions that we choose, who's at the table, and how we identify who's at the table to make decisions for community actions. Even at the international and national scales, like how are we getting voices in that space to disrupt structures that have been historically oppressive? How are we getting the Indigenous Peoples Caucus in the center of that conversation? And all of those structures at the international and national level have some histories behind them that are also problematic. It's the world we live in that we're constantly have these layers of history. So how do we shift where the power is for those decision-making opportunities, not so that we're bringing people in, because we're not talking about the including people into a space. We're talking about recreating the space so that everyone is in that space thinking about what it should look like. So we're not saying that like there is a school and it has a particular form and we're trying to bring people into the learning in that space. That's how we have done things in the past. And to really accelerate climate action, we have to rethink about what is that school. Maybe that isn't in a building, maybe it's outside, maybe the structure of teachers is shifts and we have tribal elders teaching classes in different ways on site in spaces. Maybe we have communities of color who have deep histories in some of the environmental fight that has been going on in the States, leading efforts to educate in that space. People who are white need to take their own responsibility and understand and work on their own biases and their positionalities to this work as well. Work with each other to open and expand the way that we think about each other and work with each other. So these types of collaborative learning environments that we're talking about building, there's a lot of things that have to be worked on at the same time as we engage in them. But to engage in these deep collaborative efforts, we need all different actors engaged with as much resources and shared vision that they can come to in a particular space around a goal for learning. So, one of the questions I can see.
Well, hold on.
I want to go back to that drawdown slide too for a second, but
sure,
go ahead.
I can get you. Well, so one thing I just want to, before we get back there, is that the, so from 2008 until basically now, the federal government has been funding a lot of grants around climate change education in a variety of forms. And then also philanthropic organizations have also been doing this in parallel. And until recently, we've been starting to bring them together through different network structures and collaborations, something that you and I, Deb, are both part of the Clean Network, but other things as well. But what's interesting is that through all that innovation, what's happening is that education systems, whether you're talking about zoos, aquaria, science centers, universities, community colleges, career and technical high schools, you know, all these structures that we kind of inherited, you know, in classrooms in K-12, is now when you start touching the climate work, they're starting to transform. And so what you're starting to see emerge. And so these examples, these photographs are some illustrations in my mind of where these innovations have really started to show value. So the top center one is from Climate Generation, where young people come together with, in the Capitol, leaders. That's the former governor of Minnesota and the youth calling for the future they want. That was facilitated by programs, but those conversations are really powerful. And then to have youth engagement, whether it's in you know, our island nations, or it's you know, it's through zoos and aquaria, or it's community based, or it's, you know, the solar decathlon, all these things, which is really universities, are opening up transformations in our structures already, but they're isolated. And so part of the work before us is to kind of bring them together. So you want me to go back to the project drawdown?
Let's go back for 1 second. One of the things that I was thinking about with this drawdown, and in no way do I think that drawdown is the end all and be all of solutions. But one of the things that I think it highlights from an equity and justice perspective that is interesting in it, and it makes us question some of the tenets of the current trajectory we're on, is when they did this analysis of different solutions to reverse global warming, educating girls ended up as number 6 in their sort of carbon impact level. And I think it's called the management of indigenous people's land management. That's what it's called.
Yep.
Ended up as 39, and there are a number of others in there that are similar, sort of different aspects of dimensions of equity. I think one of the things that's interesting about these is they highlight the role and impact of people in different places and positions in the world. So there's some other resources that we'll come to in a second here around Indigenous peoples. I'll come back to in a second. But in terms of educating girls, one of the ideas around educating girls and just education systems actually it's fascinating. There was a recent article out about we have high quality or highly educated, quote unquote, people in many developed countries, but these are the countries that are emitting much of the world's carbon. And so obviously education alone is not what we need to accelerate climate action. And this is, I think, to the point of education being a colonial structure, being continuing to be this idea that we can improve equity through education alone. That's actually not what is being found. What we need is education at a different type of quality, education that is really focused on empowering and solution-centered work in the world, helping people make choices both at an individual scale about what people can do in their own lives with their own bodies, and as people move out into different solutions in their families and communities. And understanding the role of girls and women in that turns out to be extremely powerful, which of course many feminists worldwide have known for a long time, but it turns out to be really impactful for climate worldwide. education generally, the sustainability reports that are coming out from UNESCO and others around education are saying climate education alone is not what we need. We need quality climate education that shows not just the problem definition, like you were saying earlier, but that is really digging into these solutions.
Yep.
And while drawdown is really helpful to think about many of the solutions, many of those are also buried in grassroots efforts around the world. So things like Climate Wise Women that highlights women from all over the world. I'll throw the website in a second. It really shows what people are doing in different locations in spaces, and that is actually led by Women Worldwide. So as we flip forward, there's a slide that we have that's talking a little bit more about some of the Indigenous peoples land management issues.
Well, let me put this in the context, because we got 8 minutes, if I got that right. Let's put this in the context of this last question, right? Which is, how do we foster systemic, equitable, and just climate learning? You're already talking about this, so let's just put it in the context of our dialectic structure, But I think really looking at that systemic, which is really where I've seen the most of the powerful work. And I mean, Deb, you're a perfect example of that work going on right in the Washington State area. But what do you think about that? How to foster systemic, equitable, and just climate learning?
I think that there are so many people worldwide that are trying to do this. And one of the things that I think data has really shown us is that where the best forest preservation, we know forests are major sources of carbon sequestration on the planet. They're important reserves of carbon and very much a lung type of function in our environment. So forest preservation is critical. And we know that when we overlay forest preservation with indigenous managed lands, we see that more lands are preserved. I think the numbers were 80% of the preserved forests are inside indigenous land management. And so that is phenomenal. And thinking about that, there's some resources on this website that kind of get into the data specifically, but thinking about that, there are some deep lessons inside that we need to unpack for broader management. And we probably know them, like we probably know we shouldn't be cutting down all our forests. And it's just a different relationship with the way we think about time, the way we think about responsibility, our worldview about our relationship with living organisms that potentially is going on inside indigenous communities in relation to their forests. But those lessons are lessons that non-indigenous people need to learn too. And they might be part of the larger solution set that we need around climate work. So in terms of thinking about diversity and thinking about access, sometimes we're actually flipping that around completely, because we're not saying that we will want to have people who have been historically marginalized in climate or in science. We're actually saying science needs to come into and open up in, like, possibly throw out a lot of its prior assumptions and gain new ones about where the questions should be centered, where the knowledge and practices should be centered. And that science has a lot to learn. So thinking about how to push the field forward that way.
One of the things we talked about, and it's kind of alludes to in this slide, is the role of coordination and collaboration networks. And so in this example, we have the international, which is the ACE for climate empowerment under the treaty, the UNFCCC treaty. At the domestic level, mostly the United States, you have CLEAN, and at the international level, but not as part of the UN, but part of the stakeholders, and I don't like that word, but leaders from across the world that are not part of government structures, but that are actually active in their own right, like yourself. ECOS is another example, but these bridging structures and coordination structures play a really important role in lifting up what you just said and then moving it across. I mean, has that been something you've seen as well?
Yeah, you know, Katie Hendrick Taylor at the University of Washington had a great paper that brought in the idea of spreading. And I really like the idea of spreading. So we're not trying to scale. We don't want to scale climate action from one place to another because that's so colonial. And it's so reproductive of the idea that what's good for one area is perfect for another area. Well, we have unique places and we have unique communities and histories in space. And so what we do in any one place is going to be slightly different than what we do in another place, but we can learn from each other. And so we need to spread the ideas across our landscape of climate action in a way that helps us hear and listen to why we did that thing in that place and how we did it, and then to leverage that into new places. And so networks like ACE, Clean, ECOS, they're all really helpful in doing that. And so I'll talk just briefly before we go into questions here about the Washington Climb Time Initiative. I've been so honored to be part of that initiative here in Washington State and working with all different communities across the state, tribal partners, the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction, the great folks inside that space, educators across the state. I haven't directly worked with students so much. I've been working across the systems level and really thinking about how we center our activity in this particular initiative. We're centered on thinking about educators and how we support educators in all different ways to broaden and transform education, both science education in terms of the next generation science standards, but also climate science specifically. And think about how it is that we cross communities. We build these bridges and layers so that community-based organizations, nonprofits working across the state or in local areas are now working with schools and districts, are building deeper relationships with some of the tribal communities that are in that space, are co-collaborating and facilitating workshops for educators, are designing their work to actually center learning on youth who have been historically marginalized. So we're not doing school as usual in this situation. We're really thinking differently about it. How could action-centered learning be inside the classroom space? How could we, you know, many of the lessons that we're learning from all of the work across the world, and how do we actually crack open schooling a little bit more with this effort? So there's a website here, climbtime.org, that's really helpful for folks to dig in and have a look at. And this year we'll be producing, we're just about ready to share them on the website, our portraits of projects. And they will give some really clear visions of what this work looks like on the ground, which will be really helpful.
So I just want to get, I know we're wrapping up here and it's been a fast moving conversation, Deb. But you know, given my perspective at the national to international and then national down to district and community and state, you know, the work that's going on in Washington State, just to give you guys some major credit here, is some of the best I've seen. And, you know, because we have state funding, both in career and technical education and in science education, but state level, it's the first time that's happened anywhere in the country. And that's really important, but then to follow it up with the richness of work and the deepness of thought and practice and what is learning in a generative way is really moving across the nation. So I'm a great partner to this. Part of my job is to lift this up and show it to New York and show it to California and show it to Minnesota and show it to Hawaii and that spreading concept. I really appreciate that insight because that is the work before us is that this is emerging and then spreading back. And it sounds like somebody's coming to the door. That's where the dog is. So this has been fun, Deb. Any other last points?
I think we'll take questions because I can see that the questions are going to really dig into some of the additional points that we've made.
Let's do it.
Let's go ahead to questions. Lindsay, I think is going to guide us through which way to go on these.
Great. Well, thank you, Frank and Deb. We really appreciate your thoughts and comments. So Isabel and I will be facilitating the Q&A portion, and the first one that we have is asked regarding the 100 solutions to reverse climate change. Why is one of the solutions focusing on just girls for education specifically?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. There's a lot written about the education of girls worldwide. And one of the sort of known understandings about girls being in school is that we shift reproduction. So we shift the birth rate and curve when we educate young girls. So that's the first sort of piece of it. And that's important from the perspective of girls are able to just delay the start of their reproductive years in ways that potentially reduce family size overall. And there are a lot of people on Earth, and that is an issue when we get into understanding our sustainability issues. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is that many women actually control decisions in different places around the world that have significant climate impact. So things about where we source our food, how we, and not to be stereotypical about this, but just the reality worldwide still and how this is situated, of how we source our food, how we handle food waste, how we, a lot of this other types of solutions that are inside Drawdown are connected to the idea of education broadly, but because there's a disproportional issue of education with girls, bringing girls education up also offers them those access to those solutions. So that's sort of a very simplistic view of some of the aspects of how girls are implicated in as a climate solution. Frank, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, so there's another dimension to this, which is some of the research that shows about decision-making, community decision-making. And what we find is that when women are at least 50% of the decisional body, the scope of the decision is more inclusive, more voices are involved in the decision, which means we as we talked before, that means you're gonna have better decision-making because you have more perspectives represented in the process. And the time step that they're looking at is much further out. It just has to be 50% or more. It doesn't have to be 100%, but just 50% or more. And so that's a really important piece, that it's more inclusive and it is thinking and focused in a longer time. And in the context of the conversation we're having here, that's critical, because short-term thinking is exactly what is getting us into the problems we're facing. And then climate change is just one planetary challenge. There are others, all of them are building into a nexus of challenges, but climate change is unfortunately the largest of the set right now. But I think that there are some gender-specific strategies that are critical to us, and that is the evidence based on this is really sound. I did put in the chat note, something from the Brookings Institute. They've done some of the best synthesis work on this body of work. Sorry. Anyway, it's really important to really deepen our understanding there.
And the, looking at the Drawdown resource around this, there's a great quote in here from Malala Yousafzai, who said, "One child, one teacher, one book, and one pen can change the world." And so that idea of how central girls can be if they have the education as well in society, as activists, as agents of change, as educators of other children. So really thinking about that role.
Great, well, thank you. So moving on, could you touch on action scientists can take to better design studies that promote equity and justice?
I'm going to just jump in on this one first, because there's an aspect that I didn't mention inside the Climb Time project that I know is coming up on a later question as well. So one of the things that's really important, I think, in any of this work is the way in which you're iteratively engaging feedback cycles from all those involved and impacted and served, and how you're increasing your circle of who's involved in those decisions. So assumably wherever you start in whatever project you're doing, it's never going to be as good as it will get if you are constantly improving. So there's different types of ways to measure and to move things that are about collaborative design and participatory design inside communities. So things like practical measures, constantly asking in short cycles that are influencing your next decision making, like what's working well, what's not working, who should be here, who's not here, you know, like you know, what other ideas do we have in this space to foster change? Those types of cycles are really important. And inside the Washington State Initiative, those were aspects of work that are, or those are aspects of work that are continually being expanded. So there was a question about communities of color and how those folks are becoming inside that initiative, largely because of the original initiative being very dominantly white. And so from the beginning of the facilitation of the Climb Time meetings, we've had learning inside the initiative of how to broaden participation in different ways, how to reach out and collaboratively engage different partners. And at the end of the first year, there was meetings with Indigenous partners all across the state to think about like their involvement that year and how it can change and shift and improve. And so those are ongoing conversations and practices inside any kind of activity, scientific or social, that I think are really critical to ensuring that equity and justice get in the middle and stay in the middle of the effort.
You know, I'm going to use an example of maybe how the scientific community are looking at this. I put in the chat a paper from some colleagues that I work with on urban heat, but they looked at it a slightly different way. We've been doing innovative urban heat science protocols, but one of the things that they looked at was, why is the exposure uneven? Meaning, why are communities unevenly exposed to heat? And what we're finding is that the redlining, that was a historical injustice that was, you know, for a long time, was part of that was putting different communities by race into more vulnerable locations in communities. That took science to unearth how that happened, but it was still, you know, it's kind of, it adds the focus that I think is just one teeny example of a really important body of work.
And I think, you know, much of that work, like so much of the work going forward, when we say the word science, science is an expanding space in which different perspectives and participants are engaged. And the goal is not to coerce everybody into a Western view of science, but to expand science to include and to think in different and new ways. So, you know, much of the work that you just named around redlining, Frank, like that came in from a lot of social scientists who were engaged in critical race theory work. And we're really defining these issues. And then we started to link them together with different types of, you know, data produced around environmental variables and understanding what's happening. And those experiences were experiences that were in communities of color already. And so trying to understand and leverage different resources and practices to make that a central question that now is being addressed in different policy ways is a move that we're trying to do here with learning. So learning is about how we lift and expose these different issues in ways that we learn from them and learn across the communities for climate mitigation and adaptation efforts.
You know, there's another dimension to this, reminding me, Deb, of something we talked about in that one of the reasons why diversifying who is involved in these processes, including science, is incredibly important, because there was a sea level rise researcher who spoke at the White House as one of these climate education literacy initiatives, and she was Latino, and what she was saying was that the reason she endured all the hardship of the scientific enterprise that is currently going on now to become a PhD sea level rise researcher is because she cared about her community. She wanted to be able to bring this expertise to inform her community and she wanted to insure it. So she persevered through some hardship, and it was her story, was what she said. But I think there's something in there that is incredibly important to remember, is that we want to make sure that the scientific enterprise has all perspectives in it, because they're coming at it for different reasons, for different purposes, but they're using the same tools and expertise. And I think that there's something valuable in there, that it is not just using the tools and strategies, but also who is using the tools and strategies. And so we have to make sure that all our sectors are more diverse for a whole host of reasons. And I think it's a really important part of this work.
It gets at the idea of like, who gets to ask the questions too,
Yep.
right?
Because who gets the benefit from the answer?
Well, we might have similar methodologies, and even methodologies are expanding, but like the questions that we ask are the way that power is initially defined inside science, and then how we go about and do that. And those questions, hopefully we get to situations where folks, it's not a struggle for people to be involved and ask the questions that they care about in those communities. And so to the question again of like how equity and justice are so central in climate sort of justice work and climate acceleration, is really about how we're centering that work on communities that are already doing this. They're already engaged in this work because they're living in spaces that are marginalized, that have historical redlining, and those are the people who are so like deeply in the middle of this work that we need to push resources and everything that we can into learning and sharing the lessons that they are struggling through right now, and figuring out how to leverage that learning that they're doing ahead of many of other communities. All right, shall we throw another question into the pool?
As an Indigenous scientist focused on environmental health, seeking employment in a time of possible recession, what advice do you have to someone like me in the early stages of my career? And this, I think, continues with that conversation on diversifying science.
Well,
yeah,
that's a great question.
Yeah, and this gets at another question that I see pop up in the chat too. They're really related. Is it's not just about being invited into this space. It's about capacity building and funding, like putting the money where it needs to be to ensure that we're building capacity in very particular ways. So in terms of seeking employment in time of recession, I think it's going to be a difficult time going forward. I actually have hope that people positioned like the person who, like Sonny, who asked this question, actually are almost perfectly positioned, hopefully, for this pivot that we hope we could make in this moment, to be able to think about a different type of economy, not necessarily an expansionistic and continuously expanding economy, but more of a sustainable economy that's focused on local food systems, that's focused on green energies, that's focused on different types of activities that can foster climate resilience and adaptation efforts. And I think that those jobs, it's kind of like the computer age in some ways, what happened where suddenly in the course of 10 years, there was a whole slew of new jobs that we just couldn't have even seen before. And so I think those jobs are starting to come forward. I've seen it in the last 5 years. I've seen an incredible amount of jobs appear for things like climate resilience officers inside cities and community planning offices. And those job descriptions, when you look at them, are really getting at diverse skills and practices that were not necessarily fostered in historical sort of science trajectories, but require these different worldviews, collaboration across different cultural boundaries, ability to draw on different scientific knowledge and practices and engage local problems. And those are the types of career options that I think are going to be really well suited for folks inside environmental health, environmental sciences, systems thinkers that can kind of pull together a lot of different fields. And we, as a sort of trajectory or a pathway into those spaces, we want to make sure that in all kinds of learning collaborations we're doing around this, that we are resourcing folks financially to participate in that, who have been constantly asked. Like locally, I have a collaboration with the Sonic First Nation here, and it's not okay for us to do those collaborations when the Sonic First Nation doesn't get paid for their time and their resources and the value that they're contributing, and doesn't own those resources. Like they need to be the ones who have ownership over those resources. So because that shifts the power dynamic of what has historically been done, right?
Yeah, so this is actually one of the things I focus on at NOAA, and there's a lot of different things we do to work on this, and then we call for it in other places. One thing I definitely wanted to highlight is there are two professional societies that you might want to consider exploring, depending on where you are in your career, whether you're beyond master's, beyond undergraduate, where you are. But ASAP, which is the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. I don't always unpack my acronyms correctly. And then the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. Those are two emerging structures that are already finding and connecting and networking those professions that we're talking about. I think that one of the other important frames to think about is that, where we are in the COVID pandemic, and that's why we're in recession, is because as we're still in the thick of active infection. But what's going to happen after the active infection, and it will pass sometime in the next year, 18 months, something in that order. That's not a government prediction, guys. That's just me thinking. Don't assume more skill than I imply. But what's going to happen is we're going to have to rebuild the economy. But we're going to have to rebuild not the economy, but a economy. And so a lot of the conversations about this is, how do we bounce back better? How do we build the economy that doesn't destroy the climate while rebuilding an economy that works for people and their communities and their livelihoods and improves quality of life? Because we're now disrupted, there's going to have to be a lot of effort to stimulate and grow out of where we are. But how we do that, which priorities we put, what do we grow? I think that I think that people who have the skill sets you're describing are perfectly positioned. The timing is going to be hard, but I think that that's something to watch for. And the conversation I'm hearing is that we're going to have to stimulate the priorities for doing that work with also dealing with climate change simultaneously. Because that funny graphic of the two scientists, the public health officers looking down at the bending the curve diagram, and behind them is the climate change bending the curve diagram, which is massive. And they're like, wow, we really did bent that curve. And then they're like, well, look behind you, dude. There's a really, 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 really big curve. And same analogy, we have to flatten that curve too. But it's a lot more work to flatten that curve. And it's a lot of work how we're doing it right now. So I definitely feel the challenges are there for the timing. But I think looking at who else is around you and who else is seeing opportunities and learning from them. So, when I'm in this situation, I get deeply networked. And so that's why I think those two are great to start with.
Thank you so much. We have about 2 more questions, if you don't mind. Often conversations about inclusivity start with the idea of increased education of communities of color. However, the barriers to participation are not addressed really. How can researchers, agencies, and NGOs can fund communities for their engagement as opposed to simply inviting them to join the conversation? When does pressure needs to be applied, or whose responsibility is funding for communities?
Yeah, that's a complicated set of things. I would actually argue, I just saw something come across my social media feed, and it was something about, it was around race, and it was, just because you're working with communities of color doesn't make you an anti-racist. And I think that that's a really important point to think about. Not much of the anti-racist effort actually needs to go toward working with white people to get them to stop being oppressive. And the same with other types of oppression. We need to be thinking about how we are working with people who are reproducing oppression to see and understand what their actions are, and why that, like from a Freudian point of view, why that's actually chaining them too. Like why you are in a very destructive cycle if you're constantly reproducing oppression in different ways. So in thinking about that idea of increasing education of communities of color, that definitely is coming from a really deficit lens. And we were just talking about this yesterday. I've heard all these new aspects of the deficit lens, like community, families can't teach at home. They don't know what education is. All different kinds of negative that are veiled sort of aspects of oppression, sometimes not that veiled. And I think what we really need to flip that script on is okay, well, what is education? And is the education that we have serving the communities that we are supposed to be serving? And if it's not, because it's really reproductive of oppression, then we need to change that. We need to shift the way we're doing education, and we need to listen differently and think about the assets and resources that communities have in their own cultural backgrounds that are things we need to foster into the space. So one of the things that we do at the Institute of Science and Math Education is really try to build resources for educators in both educators writ large, not just in the formal education system, for learning. To really think about and unpack questions as they arise. So what is this issue that I'm personally struggling with in educating youth of color? What is the issue that I'm personally struggling with in thinking about ability status in special education? How can I actually unpack my bias and create more expansive learning opportunities? So I think it kind of shifts the conversation a little bit. I don't want that to sound like I shifted it all and put it on teachers because I actually, from a systemic point of view, we really actually need to be supporting and shifting all across the system. So from governors and presidents all the way through to everyone in communities, we need to really foster education and learning in ways that help us become anti-oppression activists in all different ways and start to identify. I have this thing where I often go, you guys, and I'm like, oh, I shouldn't do that. So really shifting our discourse, shifting our activity in the world to try and see where we are doing things to take a humble stance to our own actions. Frank, do you want to pick the other half of that one out?
Well, but there's I think one of the things that so we're coming to the close of our time together, and the conversation and preparation for this that Deb and I had was deepening if you go back to the cornerstone of our conversation here was an equitable, accelerating an equitable and just climate transition through learning, right? So the why, when we came to through different literature bases, different strategies, was we need to have an understanding of the why we do these things in order to dismantle structures that actually replicate those problems, because they don't come by themselves. They don't just show up. They're not emergent. And I think that what I'm coming from this question is, how do we understand the systems, and how do we intervene in the systems, and where do you intervene in the systems and actually to get a different outcome, which means you need a strategy. And I think that we need a strategy that really deeply look at this. And that's something that Deb and I have been spending a lot of time with others, is to really understand how would it be different, and why would it be different, and what are the things we need to consider as we do this work, or else why would we expect something different? And clearly we need something different here. And I think at the center, an equitable and just transition is, you know, I've come to reaffirm my commitment to that part, because we could just do this all, you know, just throw up the wind turbines and the solar panels and electrify this, and, you know, and we're good, right? And we're like, I see that tendency. I understand where they're coming from, but I think given the length of the work and the magnitude of it, I think that's probably, no, it's not probably, it's definitely too short of what is needed. And it actually will be cheaper, faster, and more effective if it is equitable and just.
Okay, we'll stop there, I think. And Isabel, I think you're going to close us.
I really want to thank you, Frank and Deb, for all your insightful commentaries and sharing all these amazing resources. I also want to thank you all for coming and joining this amazing event. We hope to host 2 more events during the fall with different groups. And Sarah, anything that you might want to add?
Thanks, Isabel. Thank you all for joining us today. I know Deb and Frank, you may have had one last slide that you wanted to share with your contact information.
Oh yes, thank you.
Emails.
There you go.
So why don't we go ahead and stop sharing and let them share their last slide. And
Getting it?
so you all can write down their email addresses and contact them for further discussion and questions and information. And maybe while you're doing that, Frank, I will go ahead and thank both of you. I have a few acknowledgments as well. I would, again, really like to thank the behind the scenes organizers of this event, Lindsay Heaney, Constance McBaron, and Jessica Nagtalon of EarthLab. Thank you very much. I would like to thank my co-conspirators, my co-visionaries, Gina Aftab and Isabel Carrera Zamanillo, for helping to organize the Salon series overall. And then finally, of course, to thank our speakers, Deb Morrison and Frank Niepold, for your time today and sharing your very stimulating insights. It looks like it stimulated a lot of great discussion, some provocative questions. We take those to heart. We will learn from those. I would finally like to thank the audience for attending. And as Isabel mentioned, I want to invite you to join our next 2 events in this Salon series. We will be hosting this fall, whether in person or online, and we're excited to welcome some undergraduates from the University of Washington, as well as some local community groups in those salons. Keep an eye out on the earthlab.uw.edu website. And via those websites, you can get on all of our mailing lists, and we welcome you at our next events. Thank you very, very much for your attention and your time today. Please stay healthy, take care of each other, be well, and we hope to see you next time. Thanks again to our speakers, and please imagine a nice, healthy round of applause at this time.
Thank you so much for being game to do this virtually. Thank you.
It was wonderful. Thank you.